Good morning, FCCT. How are you guys doing today? All right. Okay, good. A lot of energy today. That's great. So we, as you can see, we started the remodeling project as well, the carpet aspect of that. Yesterday, we made more progress than we thought. On our next workday, we plan to finish. That's the goal. And so for everybody who helped out yesterday, I want to say thank you for all your hard work. And I know, thank you. Thank you to all those people. And I know that for a lot of you who weren't able to be here today, that you were cheering us on from wherever you were. And we could feel it. We could feel it. So I know that gave us all kinds of power. So thank you for that. As we talked about, we're having our Horseshoe International Invitational Tournament for the championship for the Cure. Right afterwards, it's indoors, so you don't have to go outside and be sweaty, so join us for that. There are ludicrous prizes available, and so we want you to win. We want you to win. Yeah, some people have other kinds of prizes. There's lucrative prizes, but we don't do those here. We do ludicrous prizes. If you want to turn to Genesis chapter 32, we'll be there in just a minute. We've been talking about through this series, Hearts That Can Hear, the issue that is a real problem, a real concern for most of us. And we see this throughout Scripture as Jesus was interacting with people of various backgrounds, various walks of life. In his ministry, the one thing that he constantly dealt with was people whose eyes were not open and their ears were not open because of issues that within their hearts. And so we want to make sure that we are dealing with our heart issues, and we want to know that our hearts are open, that our hearts can hear the love that's in the commands of Jesus. Our eyes can see the glory of who he is and what he's calling us to. And so we're dealing with as many of those issues through this sermon series as we can. And today we're going to be talking about commitment. And commitment is one of those things that is difficult for, I think, most of us. And even if we're good at committing in some areas, often we struggle with commitment in other areas. I was watching this week this documentary on a fight. And I don't know, probably most of you aren't into boxing, I would imagine. When I was little, my dad was really into it, so I developed an affinity for it. And I was watching about this series of fights that I knew nothing about between a guy named Mickey Ward, who was this great Irish fighter who was a scrapper. He was the kind of guy who didn't have a ton of technique, but man, he had an iron jaw, and he had a ton of heart, and he would just never, ever give up. And the fights, there was 3 fights between him, Mickey Ward, and Arturo Gatti. And Arturo Gatti was an Italian, and he was a fast guy, and he had power, and he was a guy who had a lot of technique, and he was a real force to contend with. And both of them were just known for having fights that were just amazing to watch. And so people said to themselves, what if we could have a fight between both of these guys? And, usually those turn out to be a disappointment, but not this one. When Mickey Ward faced Arturo Gatti, it was an unbelievable fight. In fact, some people who study these things, watch these things, think of it as one of the greatest fights that ever was. And especially they look at the 9th round of this fight. It was a 10-round fight, and throughout the fight, both of these guys were just, neither one of them would go down. Neither one of them would back off. And there were so many exchanges of blows where they just were toe-to-toe with each other, neither one of them giving an inch. They were fully committed to victory. They were fully committed no matter what the cost. And it was interesting that Mickey Ward had a situation where his eye was cut really early in the fight, and so he just had blood all over his face. I know that's gross, but it's boxing, right? He had blood all over his face, and Arturo Gatti, at one point in the fight, his eyes were almost completely shut, being swollen. And in the 9th round, it looked like Arturo Gatti was going to win this fight because he just had the better technique. But Mickey Ward was known for a particular punch, and it was a punch as a liver punch, a punch to the body. And this punch was so hard that he knocked out a large number of opponents with this body shot. The pain was so crippling that these guys could not go on. They would drop to the ground and not be able to go on. But in the 9th round, when it looked like Gotti was going to win, Ward connected with this body shot. And Gotti crumpled to the ground, agony written all over his face. And you could look at him and see he is not going to be able to go on. He is done. In fact, the announcer said, I don't think he has a chance. He is done with this fight. And yet he rose to his feet, grimacing the whole time. And he went back into the fight. And throughout the 9th round, Ward over and over again knew that this was now a soft spot, connected with that body shot over and over again. And throughout this round, Gotti would just grimace with pain, and then he would come back in, and he would, to everyone's astonishment, he would start connecting, he would start landing blows. Everybody in the crowd was on their feet. And the 9th round ended, and Gotti had made it. And they went to the 10th round, and the same thing happened, just blow after blow, neither man backing up. In a very close decision, Mickey Ward was awarded the victory. But a number of fans don't even remember who won the fight because it wasn't important. The fact is that both of these guys had thrown everything they had into this fight. And because of that, it's remembered as one of the greatest fights ever. Both of these guys had shown complete commitment to something. Now, it's something that many of us would not see a lot of value in. But they had shown complete commitment, and it made an impact to where now there are announcers who, out of all the fights that they ever did the announcing for, this is the one that they remember. Why? Because to see that kind of commitment is unusual. And why is it unusual? Well, because it's so hard for us as human beings to commit. When we go to Genesis chapter 32, starting in verse 22 today, what we're going to see is we're going to see the kind of commitment that one of the guys in the Old Testament had and what the result of that commitment was. Genesis 32, verse 22. This is one of the stories of Jacob. And if you remember, Jacob, he's lived a difficult life. Jacob was the second of twins, and in the time that he lived in, what happened is that if you were the firstborn, then you got the what was called the birthright. You got a double portion of inheritance, and kind of you were seen as the one who carried the lineage. And normally this is a pretty big deal, but in this case it's even a bigger deal because God has made a covenant with Abraham. And because God has made a covenant with Abraham and his descendants, we have to know, well, which descendant, as we go down the line, who's going to carry this covenant? Who's going to be the one whose family is going to be the family, the one? And so what we see here is in Genesis chapter 32, verse 22, we see this, that Jacob has, let's say, creatively been able to, we're putting this in the best possible light, he's been able to creatively garner for himself the birthright and the blessing from his father. Now, he did this through, let's call it a scam, a swindle, and his brother's none too happy. He's had to flee, and since he's fled, things have not gone particularly well for him. In Genesis 32, verse 22, it says, "The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day has broken.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' And he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' Then he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.'" Jacob's in a tough situation as he's in almost every point in his life. And he wrestles with this being, this man, that's more than a man. And he wrestles with him all through the night. And even after his hip is put out of socket, he still won't let go. He's holding on. This is important to him. He's completely committed to this. And he says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he gets the blessing of this name, Israel. And this blessing of the name Israel is the one, it says, that is striven with God and with men and have prevailed. The idea here is that not that this blessing doesn't seem like a blessing to us. I think if we're looking at it and we're trying to figure out, well, would I see that as a blessing? Getting renamed to the guy who's striven with God and with men and have prevailed? Is that worth the kind of commitment that it takes? Because here's the thing. Jacob spends the rest of his life walking with a limp. That's the blessing that he's been given. The kind of commitment that you see over and over again in the Old Testament is a kind of commitment that we struggle with, especially in modern times. And so we're going to talk about three different aspects of this. First of all, why is everything so difficult? Why is it? Because really, when we think about it, it's kind of like inflation. Why is everything so expensive? Why is everything so difficult? Because really, when you look at life, that just seems to be the nature of it. The second thing we want to look at is the place of commitment. What's it for? And secondly, we're going to look at thirdly, we're going to look at the cost of discipleship. So let's start with, why is everything so difficult? Have you ever wondered why God just doesn't appear to you and tell you what you need to do? Did you ever wonder that? I mean, because he does it in times in the Old Testament, doesn't he? Like an angel appears to people and he goes, hey, you got to go do this, you got to go to that. You know, he goes to Abraham and says, hey, go to a land I will show you. And there are various times when he just appears and he says, this is exactly what I'm looking for from you. And people often rightly ask, well, why doesn't God do that with me today? Why doesn't God show up and tell me what I should do? Why doesn't he tell me who I should marry? Why doesn't he tell me which job I should take? Why is it that God is not making this easier on me? And some people will even say, well, I would believe in God if he would just show up and tell me that he exists. Along with this, we have the complaint of, why is life in general so hard? Why is it so hard to make ends meet? Why is it so hard to keep relationships on track? Why is it so difficult to raise our families and to bless our children the way that our hearts desire to bless them? Why does that so often go astray? Why don't I get what I want in general? And more importantly, why do I suffer? Despite how some people criticize the Bible as being kind of a Pollyannish view of the world, it really isn't. It presents these struggles and these challenges, these difficulties, in a very gritty way. So why is life so hard? Well, I think the problem is that we often misunderstand the goal and what God is trying to do in our lives. You see, oftentimes we think that the reason that God enters into our lives, or God enters into human history, we think the reason why the Bible is written is because God wants us to believe in him. And we say, well, God, it would be easier to believe in you if you just made it easier, right? If you just appeared, it would be so much easier to believe. But the problem is this: it's a misunderstanding of what the point of the Bible is. The Bible is not trying to get you to believe in God. The Bible is trying to get you to commit to God. And that's a totally different purpose. And you don't ask, why doesn't God make it easier to commit? Because easy and commitment run counter to each other. You can't make it easier to commit. That's not the nature of commitment. In James chapter 2, verse 19 through 23, it says, you believe that God is one, you do well. You believe in God, and you believe that there is one God. You believe that God is one. That's great. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that bar is set way too low. You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. Do you understand that when you come to a belief that God exists, you haven't gotten past the point that the demons already are? They understand, they believe. The demons believe that God exists. In fact, their belief is probably stronger than most people who walk the earth today. They know for certain that God exists. They believe in him. They believe in him from the standpoint of knowing that he is there and that he exists, but they are not committed to him. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Now, what does it mean, this faith apart from works? It means having a belief but not having it come out in the things that you do. You could look at it from the standpoint of we could almost rename this, do you want to know that belief apart from commitment is useless? Was not Abraham, our father, justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? Does that take a little bit of commitment? Is that more than just belief? When Abraham has his son Isaac, and he's going to offer him on the altar, he is all in. That is complete, total, utter commitment. I am completely committed to God. I am completely committed. My life is everything about my future, everything about what God has promised to me. I'm laying it all on the line. And if God says, I want this from you, I will give it. You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. You want to know that belief without commitment is useless? You have to look at scripture and see that everywhere you find God moving in people's lives, there's a commitment that takes place. Do you want to be rewarded for just doing what the demons do? Belief is not the point. You see, the problem is what most people want is not what God wants. What most people want out of life is not, they don't want God. What we want is we want comfort, or the American dream. We want the house with the white picket fence, a tree in the front that has a hole in it for the animals to live in. We want the family. We want the 2.4 kids. We want the comfort. We want the nice job. That's what we're looking for in life. And we say, God, can't you just help me to get that thing? But that's the problem, right? Is that God becomes the tool to get the life that I really want. God becomes the tool to get the thing that I'm really committed to. And that's not what God is looking for, because when we've done that, we've created an idol, and we want God to bless it. Job had it all in his life. Job had everything. We've been studying Job in our morning Sunday school class, Sunday mornings. And Job had it all. He had the great family. He had the great life. He was respected. He was righteous. He was wealthy. And he lost everything. And Job struggles with why it was all taken. Job struggles over and over again throughout the book, and we see that his friends come and they give answers, and his friends' answers are representative of kind of the theological thinking of the time. They give all the best answers. And what's great about the book of Job is the book of Job encounters this struggle of why things are difficult. Why do we suffer? And it does it on the hardest possible setting. It makes it as hard as possible because it posits the whole time that Job is a righteous man. It would have been so easy if Job was not a righteous man, because you could say, well, Job, the reason you're having your struggles is because you brought them on yourself, you've sinned, and that's the reason. But that isn't the reason. And so it struggles with this idea of why are things so difficult? Why is it that God puts us through this suffering? And if you can say, well, God doesn't put us through it, well, He allows it at least. Why does He do that? There's a difference between God versus what God gives. And we have to take that seriously. You see, a lot of times what we say to ourselves is, man, I'm committed to God, but really, we're really committed to what God gives. God gives me these things. God gives me a family. God gives me a life. God gives me a job. God gives me comfort. God gives me pleasure in this life. God gives me all these things. And the question really becomes is, are we committed to God or are we committed to what God gives? And you might say to yourself, well, that's not really that important. That distinction isn't that important, but it is, and we know that it is. How many times do you laud the one who marries for the money? Right? You say, there you go. There you go. Right on. Somebody says, oh, they just married for the money. You go, I know. Isn't that great? No, we don't do that, do we? Do we laud the one who divorces to get the newer model? Do we laud them? Do we say, oh, yeah, they gave up the older one and they went out and found the young one, and isn't that great? Do we laud these things? Or do we recognize within ourselves that to be committed to something that comes along with is not the same thing to be committed to the thing itself? It's called a mercenary reward. And we tend to view poorly those who put that in a place that it doesn't belong. Jacob, throughout his history, has gone after the benefits. The question is, does he want the God who brings those benefits? Really, when we look at commitment, we're looking at something that we find difficult because commitment really means in itself death to ourselves. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 24, it says, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Why is commitment so hard? Because in commitment, we actually are forced to die to ourselves. We're actually forced to give up parts of ourselves. Why is it that we need to suffer? Why is it that we need to go through pain? Why is it that we need to go through that? Why can't we just say, I will go through a little bit and not the rest of it? Well, we're trying to hold some of ourself back. So, setting up this morning for our shindig this afternoon, and that's the technical term, the shindig. Setting up for that, you can't really have a good party without music. And so we needed music, and we have these big powered amps. They're kind of speakers that used to be on our stage a long time ago, but they've been relegated to being in the back. And they're perfect for these times, these situations. And so I went and I got one out. And I went and I took it all the way in there, and it's very heavy, and I was tired. There was a lot of work yesterday, work this morning, kind of arranging chairs and putting things back together. And so I'm tired, and I go and I pick up this big speaker. We have two of them. This is the one I can see. This is the one I can find. I pick it up. I take it into the fellowship hall, and I get it all set up, and it doesn't work. Right? How many of you guys know what I'm talking about? You know, if there's one that works and one that doesn't, you have a 99% chance of grabbing the one that doesn't work, right? Now, in my mind, I thought both of them worked. And so I get it all the way out there and it doesn't work. And I'm like, of course, this is the one. And where is it? Where even is the other one? And so I go back there, and because we're doing all this remodeling, there's stuff back there that doesn't need to be back there. And so I'm looking around, I can't find it, climbing over things, and I get into this room, and I peek into this room because you can only open the door so far because all the old pulpit's back there, and it's sitting in the way. And so I get in there, and I look, and I see it in there, and of course, that's where it is. Somebody put it away. Ah! You don't want to put these things away. I can't get to it. So I move all that stuff over, I grab the amp, I put it up on my shoulder, I'm balancing on things as I'm walking through between things, and I get it all the way out to the fellowship hall, and guess what? It doesn't work. You guys know what I'm talking about, don't you? And you say to yourself, why, right? You say to yourself, why is it so difficult? And then you start thinking, well, what can I do to solve this problem? And then the answer gets sifted through how difficult is that solution, right? You know what I'm talking about, don't you? You sift that through. Well, how difficult is that solution? Because you're not fully committed to it. If it's a certain level of effort, you will proceed. But if it goes beyond that level of effort, you're like, it's not worth it to me, right? You're holding back some of yourself. And that's what we do, is we hold back. That's why commitment is so hard, because there's a certain dying to ourselves that has to happen. You have to say, you know what, I'm all in. It doesn't matter how difficult it is. If I could possibly do it, I will. If there is anything in me, if there's any ounce of strength. When Arturo Gatti was down on the mat and there was this pain in his face, he could have quit. In fact, I saw an interview with a guy that got punched by Ward in the side, and he said, you know what? It's the most painful thing I ever experienced. And I went back to my corner, and my dad is my coach, and I said, Dad, stop the fight. I'm done. I don't want to take this anymore. We hold back ourselves and we say, God, this is too much. I need to reserve some for myself. Because there's a fear. There's a fear of dying to ourselves. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, it says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. We could say commitment, couldn't we? I live by commitment in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Why am I committed to Jesus? Because he was committed to me. So let's talk about the place of commitment. There's an interesting experiment that was done in the 60s called Universe 25. Has anybody ever heard of this? Universe 25? It was also known as the Mousetopia experiment, where this guy created this basically utopia for mice. And he put 9 mice in there, and it had a carrying capacity. It had enough food, water, and space and everything else for 6,000 mice. Guy liked mice, okay? So he ran this experiment 30 times, putting 9 mice in and then seeing what happened. And every time, the population shot up to 1,000, went a little slower to 2,000, and at 2,000 it dropped off, and all of the mice died. 30 times this happened. And he wanted to know, why is this happening? So they did a lot of studying, of both behaviorally studying the mice and also doing tests on the mice. And what they found was that all of the mice, this kind of the social order collapsed. The males became feminized. And you say, well, what does a feminine mouse look like? Well, they looked at behavior, and they also measured the hormones in the urine. And the male mice became feminized. The female mice became masculinized. There was a group that was called the beautiful ones, and the beautiful ones would just, all they would do all the time was they would just clean themselves. And they would never get into romantic relationships with any other mice. They would just clean themselves. If they could have selfies, they probably would be doing that. There was some that completely hid from any social interaction at all. And then there was a group that became aggressive and would kill any of the ones that tried to maintain a social order and tried to procreate. And eventually, the population would collapse. Don't take any lessons from it. It has nothing to do with anything. So here's the thing. Why did this collapse? Well, they don't know exactly, but there was a lot of theories that they had. Part of the problem seemed to be that everything was given to them too easy. And that when the population reached a certain point, that agency was driven away from each individual action and each individual mouse. What does that mean? It means that at a certain point, what you do doesn't matter. How many of you guys have ever worked for a really big corporation and you felt like it didn't matter what you did every day to the outcome of the corporation? Anyone? Like if you've ever worked for a really big corporation, I'm sure you felt that. It doesn't matter what I do, it doesn't lead to anything else. And they surmise that what happens with mice is that at some point it doesn't matter what any mouse particularly does, and they stop doing anything. And that everything becomes too easy. All the food is there, all the recreation, all the other mice are there. And that really there's a certain amount of commitment that's required for beings to live and to thrive and to exist. There's a desire to avoid commitment. At the same time, commitment is necessary for healthy living. And there seems to need to be some kind of motivation in order to get this. And what they've seen by comparing this Universe 25 and kind of what they've seen from civilizations and how they collapse, there seems to be either a necessary outward motivation or a necessary inward motivation. And what they tend to see is that societies tend to thrive when they're rural and religious and die when they're not rural and irreligious. What it seems to suggest is that if it doesn't seem to matter from a physical standpoint what you do, you will have no motivation to do anything. And the only caveat to that seems to be if there's an internal motivation that's provided by some kind of a value structure or religion, that seems to be the only thing that counteracts that. Ultimately, what it's saying is you need a spiritual or a physical reason to commit yourself. And without committing yourself, healthy living isn't possible. Well, what do we take from any of this? The only thing that truly survives is what's placed on the altar. What is sacrificed, what is committed, what is given over to something else. The only thing that's transformed is what's placed on the altar. And you can kind of think about this and understand how it works by just kind of looking around at life. If you've ever known somebody who was a great artist, they probably committed themselves to becoming a great artist. And as they committed that part of their life over to this goal, this desire, as they committed their life over to this, that's the part of them that was transformed. If you know somebody who is like really committed to being fit and in shape, that part of their life, they've given themselves over to this ideal, and that part of their life, because they've given it over, is transformed. But the thing is, it doesn't happen unless it's really committed. And we know that's true, don't we? How many of you guys have ever started exercising and then stopped like within a month, 2 months? Anyone? Come on, this is confessional time. You can tell me. We're all friends here. You've done it, haven't you? Have you noticed a big transformation? Did you got ripped and everything was fine after that, and so there was no need to. No. What happened was because you didn't commit, that part of your life wasn't transformed. You see, that part of your life that you really commit, that you put on the altar, that's the only part that gets transformed. And you would think that we would learn this as we put parts of our life on the altar and we see it transformed. You think that we'd say, wow, I want to put all of my life on the altar. And yet it seems that we don't often do that. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7 and 8 says, have nothing to do with irreverent, silly myths. Rather, train yourself for godliness. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come. If you have to choose between committing yourself in some way that's physically beneficial and committing yourself in a way that's spiritually beneficial, it's saying choose the spiritual side. Choose the thing that's spiritually beneficial. Why? Because it transforms your life here and now and also in the age to come. But if all you do is choose the physical side, well, you'll get some benefit of it now, but when your body dies, it's gone. Now, it doesn't mean don't commit yourself physically. It means that if there's a choice to be made, then always make sure the physical or the spiritual is the one that gets priority. Well, let's finally talk about the cost of discipleship. In Luke chapter 14, verse 33, Jesus sums up a section on paying the price this way. He says, "So therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." Man, that seems like a high bar. But the truth is explained so well in Scripture. Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it cannot bear fruit. The only thing that ends up being glorified is the thing that is given up, the thing that is dedicated, the thing that is committed. So if you want to be glorified, then you should commit all that you have. In John 13, verse 8 and 9, it says this: Peter is dealing with Jesus, and Jesus is wanting to wash the disciples' feet. And knowing that that's the task of the lowest servant in the house and that Jesus is far from that, Peter says, "No, not going to do it." Back to verse 8, it says, Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." I'm never going to let you do this, Jesus. I will not allow you to humiliate yourself. You see, that would be Jesus giving up all of the prestige that he has of being a great teacher and all the power. You see, the disciples, they welcomed Jesus as the Messiah, the coming king. And no king does that. It's to give up all the grandeur and all the glory and all the prestige and all the nobility of that, and they will not let him do it. At least Peter says, "You will not do this. You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Peter says, "Okay, well, if that's the case, then you can have all of it." The reality is, Jesus dedicated everything to the Father, who was making a way for us. Jesus has given everything up to the Father, and in doing so has given everything up for us. Everything has been committed to us. And the only way to receive all of it is to commit everything to him. The reality is that we've been called to come and die. We've been called to come and to commit everything. Why? Because Jesus wants to glorify everything. And the only thing that gets glorified is the thing that's committed and laid on the altar. So what we're called to do is to give up everything, to hold nothing back, but our heart's desire to keep apart. There's a part of your heart that's afraid to give itself to God. The part that fears that if it does, it will be impoverished. That if it gives something up, it won't have it for itself, and it desperately wants to have all it can. The part that fears it will be taken advantage of because in times past it's made commitments and it got taken advantage of. There's a part of your heart that fears that it will give more than it gets. You see, all of us have hearts that fail to hear the call of Jesus. That in giving up everything and fully committing to him, we will be able to receive all that he has committed to us. So what are you avoiding that you know you should be doing? What commands are you failing to follow? There's probably something right now that's gnawing at you. A part of you that you have failed to give up to God, that God says, "I need that part. And if you give me that part, it will be glorified." Ultimately, we often find that we have a lack of trust in the nature of God. We have a hard time seeing the value of having God over having everything else. And we miss out on the love and the call to commit. We simply fail to hear it. Discipleship costs us everything because anything else is not really discipleship. The relationship that Jesus wants with us is that we give everything to him, and he gives all of himself to us. And everything that we hold back is something that he cannot bless and transform. for God to be our God and for us to be his people means submission in all things. Otherwise, ultimately, something else is your God. You become what you worship because you commit to that thing. After the fight between Gotti and Ward, the immediate question, because it was so evenly matched, is when is there going to be a rematch? And there was. And Gotti had trained and trained. By this time, Ward was 36 years old. He's losing a little bit. And it was a brawl just like the first fight. Both of the men not yielding. Both of them constantly going in, giving no care for their bodies and the damage that they were taking. Neither one would be knocked out. The fight would go to the judges, and Gotti would be given a narrow win. And then the question was, well, now that it's 1-1, is there going to be another rematch? And the answer was yes, there will be. And in this rematch, it was going the same way as the second fight, where Gotti, because he was the better boxer, seemed to be winning until he went for a body shot. He was going to do to Ward what Ward had done to him. But in doing that, he missed, hit his hip, and broke his right hand. He went back to his corner, and he said, "I've broken my hand. I can't use it any longer." And the man in his corner, his trainer, said, "What do you want to do?" And he says, "I want to go on." And so amazingly, he came back out. And every time he threw a right, he would connect, and you would see the pain on his face as he was punching with a broken hand. Unbelievably, he was able to withstand the onslaughts of Ward, who now didn't have to worry so much about his right hand. And he was again declared the victor after 10 rounds. The people who were close to Gotti said that one of the things that was hard about the third fight is that they said it started off being us versus them. But by the third fight, by 30 rounds, they said we cared about them as much as we cared about ourselves. That it wasn't us versus them, it was us and them. And this was shown when both of the fighters ended up having to go to the hospital after the fight. They ended up in the same room, just separated by a curtain. And when the doctor pulled back the curtain, the first thing that Gotti said to Ward was, "Are you okay?" They became fast friends. In fact, that was Ward's last fight. He retired and he became Gotti's trainer. Gotti would be dead in a few years due to suspicious circumstances. It looks like it could have been murder. And Ward was there to give the eulogy. Because both of these men had committed everything, they become something closer than brothers. You see, that's what happens when you commit everything. Because there's no self left to get in the way, you find that you can become closer, not only to God, but to each other. Now, I'm not saying that they were close to God. I'm using them as an example, but you see the point. The point is that giving up yourself does not impoverish you, but makes you richer.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow on our Facebook page, where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week, everyone.